So can I call the panelists back to the front? Erin Grogan is going to facilitate the discussion here.
All right, so I was asked to talk a little bit, or guide us through a discussion about using data to inform innovation within teacher preparation programs. And I think we've just seen two really nice case studies of that. And if you all have a chance to read the papers from both of these institutions, I'd highly encourage you to do that, because it really does give a lot of rich detail about how these programs are thinking about really what we might call continuous improvement, informed by their data. And when Bob asked earlier how might programs learn from each other, I started thinking a little bit about almost a data paradigm that might help us answer that question by talking more and sharing more and enabling more of that kind of learning. Although Diana just ended by saying they're looking for more data and different types of data, I don't know about other programs, but in the Teaching Fellows program, I often feel like I'm swimming in data, because this is sitting on my desk every day, and it becomes a little overwhelming. How do you make sense of, so many data points for 1,000 teacher candidates every year when you're trying to learn about the success of your program, but you're also trying to inform one-on-one coaching of candidates or small group content-based cohorts of candidates who you have coaches and cooperating teachers working with. So I guess I'd propose here that we have several checkpoints along the way when we might use what we know about a candidate up to that point in time in order to learn more about what comes next, as well as think about those outcomes we've all talked about caring about, whether that's job placement or retention in the profession, or some of these performance-based measures, to look back at how that group of in-service teachers actually performed as candidates, to learn about any potential opportunities to provide individualized supports differently, or as I'll propose, I guess, in a minute, maybe make some decisions about filtering people onto a different pathway if they're not ready to become a teacher of record. And I liked Diana's comment of being ready for service. I hadn't heard that before, but that was an interesting way of putting it. The other thing I'd say is I think both of these papers, if you read them, were really framed around accountability being the impetus for going deep into the data, but both institutions really used that push to do a lot of learning internally and to really think about the innovations that they wanted to make very close to their teacher candidates. So it wasn't necessarily just about that educator dashboard that we saw some evidence of, but it was really getting close to the people who worked with their candidates every day and using that data to inform what they did with the candidates. So I think some of the conversation I've heard so far today really made me think about using this vast amount of data and hopefully one day adding in the other pieces we'd like to have in multiple ways. One is this rapid response learning that involves your cooperating teachers, your teacher coaches if you have them, mentors if you have them. And the other is what was proposed by Bill, which is research on how to do this endeavor of training teachers well, which just necessarily requires a longer view of these data. And in my world, those things sometimes feel at odds with each other, because I have coaches who want to make a decision about supporting a teacher tomorrow, and they can't wait 2 school years to know if what they were doing today worked. So I'm curious to hear from the programs and some of the other programs represented here as well. How are you balancing that push to support your people who are working in the field with teachers every day with really taking the time to learn about, does your program work? That question we all want to answer.
So I think we're not there yet. It's something that we talk about a lot, and I'm on this faculty data committee, and for example, we use the class to assess our candidates, but we don't give them their scores. And part of it is logistical. We need to get enough people who can score them, and sometimes that happens in the summer, and sometimes that happens after they've already graduated. So we can't always use it as the kind of continuous improvement system that in an ideal world with unlimited resources we might want to. But I think it's something we're thinking about, and we've thought about actually giving some of them randomly feedback as we go and see if we can do that, if we can sustain it, and if it leads to different kinds of trajectories and outcomes for our candidates. But I think it's a complicated question and something that we wrestle with.
We haven't figured it out either. I think as part of each one of the innovation teams that I've shared, there's a group of faculty and P12 partners that meet on a regular basis. So while the faculty may meet monthly, the P12 partners come into those meetings maybe twice a year. And they do a richer or deeper data analysis on things like the outcome measures that might come from TPA. They look at focus group feedback and survey feedback together, and then they use that in order to refine the innovation over time. But that took a lot of time and grist to try and get up and going, because you're talking about P12 partner time coming in. How do you pay for a sub for that? I mean, there are all the little procedural things that kind of get in the way of what you would like with engaging for those folks in that work. So it takes a lot of effort to maintain that.
Does anybody from another program want to weigh in? Yeah.
I want to contest this model for just a second.
Sure.
So if you look at this slide, these are prediction models. And if we had powerful instruction, we ought to be able to shake up the correlation between input variables and output variables. So one could say that a powerful program should have correlations of 0 between input and output.
Say more about that.
Well, the point of having a program, the point of spending money on the program is to teach people to do things, right? We all agree? Okay, so if the people who come into the program who are low on whatever your variable is, come out of the program low relative to their peers, and people come in high, stay high relative to their peers, you have no aptitude treatment interaction. You have disordinal interaction. It's the Matthew effect. He who hath shall get. But we should have programs that shake up that. We should have programs that teach people things differently so that there should be no relationship between the input variables and the output variable. That's the point.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Can I make another point?
Please.
I don't know if it
Yeah.
doesn't directly answer your question, but I'm a little worried. This and the discussion were, I think, given the limited time about practice in a teacher ed program, and this sort of the implication that it's theory or practice. And so now we have university programs, and we're focusing more on practice. But the implication could be, first of all, it's an issue of theory or practice. Methods courses, for example, have a lot of theory in them. And we're told nationally that things like social foundations courses, multicultural education courses are non-essential because they're not focused on practice. And so there are a variety of places, speaking the history, university programs that are teaching those courses in place-based, context-specific ways that make the issues really very relevant, and I would argue, in fact, essential to teachers being successful in the kinds of contexts they're going. So it's not this sort of a thread going through this about focusing on practice, and that's good. I've spent most of my career doing research on practice, directing clinical programs, but I'm worried about this sort of, because it's happening in the larger debates, being reinforced here that somehow theory is bad and universities focus on too much theory. It's the issue of how you focus on it and the way it's connected to the context where people go teach.
Yeah, I would like to pick that up and just use one of the programs that I work with as maybe a mini case study of this. So we have a Baltimore City teaching residency program. It is an alternative certification program, but designed in collaboration with the district, and realized that we had swung too far in the direction that you just laid out, that it was all about practice. And in fact, they spent 6 weeks of training practicing instructional techniques. And when the Freddie Gray riots rocked the city of Baltimore, our teachers were not prepared to respond to that, and were teaching in schools where Freddie Gray's family was attending. They were teaching in those neighborhoods, and we just realized that we had missed something really, really important, and that we had to rethink our training to figure out a way to bring in this concept of culturally responsive pedagogy, which somebody mentioned earlier. And I won't say we've got it figured out, and there's a lot of collective power in this room that has been thinking about those issues for a really long time. But we are adjusting our training based not on data in this model, but just on what our teachers experienced in the field and talked about with their coaches, who also, frankly, were not always well prepared to deal with it. So it comes back to a question of time, and I think we could probably all talk about the balance of time in our programs. How do we make sure that we fit in these critically important spaces for teachers to learn these skills while also being ready to manage a classroom and get to instruction? So thank you for raising that. Please. Yep.
I'll make a very quick and possibly irrelevant comment. This discussion leads me to think about how important it is that you're measuring the right stuff when you're measuring outcomes. And of course, we want teachers to do so many different things that measuring the right stuff means measuring a ton of stuff. And it reminds me of the Borges story, which I think is called On the Exactitude of Science, something like that. It's a short story that's about this long. You can all Google it right now. Well, no, don't Google it in about 30 seconds when I'm done talking. And the story is about this king who is very dissatisfied with the quality of the maps because the maps do not contain sufficient detail, and the cartographers continue to come back with new maps. And finally, they produce a sufficient map, which is the exact size of the empire. It is a one-to-one replica. And so again, we have another kind of dilemma here where if we want to measure everything that matters, we will measure so many things that the measurement will be impossible to use. And so I think it's a useful way of thinking about, let's say outcomes-based measures of programmatic effectiveness, where you really do need to measure a lot of different things, but you really can't measure a lot of different things. So maybe I'll leave off there.
I don't think it's irrelevant at all. It actually allows me to ask a question.
It was relevant to you.
Yeah, it was relevant. Yeah, so one person's all. Yeah, so I guess I think this is probably thanks to Bob, but I was recently asked whether or not I would be willing to take the other side of the argument on the data issue, because I've been a big fan of teacher preparation programs being more self-conscious about how they use the information that they collect already, or that's part of their lives already, in order to inform this kind of continuous improvement. But Gary Henry called me up and said, we need somebody to write about how the collection of data might not be an unmitigated good. And how can we conceptualize in what ways is this focus on data helping us, but also in what ways does this focus on data get in our way of doing good teacher preparation, which was the question I wanted to ask, and you just opened the door. So I'd like to hear how people think about this. Like I have some ideas, simple-minded things like that. Every time you decide you're going to measure something, you obscure, as somebody said earlier today, when we focus on one thing, we obscure other things. We know from the history of NCLB what happens when you collect data and narrow the vision of what it is that the collection of data as narrowing the vision of what it is that we care about. I'm absolutely positively sure that somebody smarter than I am could come up with a list of very interesting unintended consequences of this right now sort of like faith that if we just collected the right kind of data and enough of it, this would solve our problem. So if somebody on the panel wants to help me with this paper, which it was worth the ticket coming if somebody could give me an idea.
Diana, yeah.
Go ahead.
I think I've been guilty of this on my campus, certainly, and it hasn't made me some friends. As I started my work, I was in charge of the assessment and accreditation office. We had to have the data to meet different reports and requirements. But I think what this process has allowed us to do is to think more deeply about the quality of the data that we have collected, and so that it's not just data. I mean, if it just sits somewhere, it's just data. But what are we really going to take and create into information, something that's going to be actual information for us to use for program improvement purposes. And if it's going to be just data, then why are we collecting it? And can we cull down and reduce the numbers of things that we are actually collecting and focus on the things that are really impactful in our programs? And that's easier said than done because we're required by the state or by the federal government to meet so many different things and fill so many boxes. But I think that's an important step for us to move forward as a field to have give more voice to what should we collect rather than being told we needed to collect things.
Let's go to the end and then Bob.
So I promised myself I wouldn't talk about this, but here I am talking about this. So I had the inglorious opportunity of being on the U.S. Department of Education's negotiated rulemaking committee for Titles 2 and 4 for teacher education regulations. For those of you who don't know about that, God bless you. But the new teacher ed regs will probably come out. Who knows? They've been doing this for years and years and years. But here is a result of data that is maybe not intended in the first place. So the impetus of that particular negotiated rulemaking round that lasted about 6 months was to link Titles 2 and 4 of the Higher Education Act. For those of you who don't know these titles, all of us in teacher ed know Title 2, of course, because that's our data report. And Title 4, of course, is the authorization for almost all the federal student financial aid. And it was the U.S. Department of Education's intention, Secretary Duncan at the time, to use the data quality, to use the quality ratings in Title II to limit funding for students in undergraduate programs or teacher education programs under Title IV. There actually is no federal law now that allows that to happen, and if we were the canary in the mine, if you will, that means that all fields across the universities, their quality indices, maybe their accreditation reviews and so on, could then be used to limit who would get funding for student loans, Pell Grants, and so on and so forth. You can imagine the horrific mess that this would create. You're an education, or you're an education major today, your program is of low quality, and tomorrow you're going to be an engineering major. I'm just making this up. So you can get funding in engineering, but not in education. So you get students being pushed around campus on the basis of where they can get federal grants and where they can't get federal grants. So that's perhaps the worst outcome of it. But in the process of doing this, all of you who fill out the Title II, how many of you here fill out Title II reports? So you know those narrative data, what you do for technology and so on? I asked that during those hearings, I asked the federal negotiators who in the Department of Education read those things and what was the analysis that they did upon them to render them into useful information for the secretary. And there was this great pause. There were 14 people from the Department of Education in the room. They all looked at each other, and the negotiator turned around and said to me, "Nobody reads them." I said, "Why do we have them?" "Well, to inform your publics, because you're required to put it on your website." So I immediately texted my director of communications, and I said, how many, because we have Google Analytics on all our pages, as you do, how many people have read our Title II pages? 0. So there's an unintended negative consequence of data.
Thank you. Bob and then Rebecca.
So first of all, the Gary Henry thing, I didn't name you, but Gary Henry picked you for this. And I said, no, it can't be Suzanne because she drank the Kool-Aid. So now I may have to reconsider your eligibility for this. And the other thing, I was wondering, back in the first panel, whether the current pushback on assessments, you know, with parental opt-out and now the new ESSA rather than ESEA, will allow teacher preparation programs to broaden again the range of goals that they're trying to achieve. And it's been quite clear that everything was pushing towards student achievement on standardized tests given by states. That was the direction we're going. And now maybe this is an opportunity to bring back preparing students to deal with students with special needs and to teach in urban schools and a variety of other things.
Rebecca.
just to pick up on Suzanne's question about the way that data may be shaping things in unexpected ways. And one of the things that I often hear is a phrase, the data say. And I think that's a really powerful phrase to consider because it's as if the data are able to speak independently of human beings and as if human beings did not have responsibility for creating, shaping, collecting, choosing the questions, putting it together, deciding what should be measured. And I do hear a lot of people in education today using the phrase the data say as a way of avoiding the personal responsibility for what is happening. And so I do wonder, as we think about preparing the next generation of teachers under a model very data-driven, how that will shape the way that they view their own agency and their own ideas about what actions they're taking to shape the data? Or is it simply that they view their students through the data as if they're no longer then responsible for it? Or what is their relationship then to these data, and how do we still instill some sort of deeper belief that I as a person have agency over this?
Yeah. Karen, I think you wanted to respond.
Yeah, oh, this isn't, all right, great. Well, just to kind of pick up on that comment about the fact that the kind of data that we choose to focus on shapes how people think about teaching. We also, I think, as a teacher education sort of faculty and programs have the opportunity and almost the responsibility to communicate to the public a conception of what teaching is. And right now in the United States, I think the general public has a fairly kind of limited understanding of the depth required to really do powerful teaching. And I think the kinds of visions that we share through our programs, and in a way our programs are a hypothesis about what good teaching is. So we're communicating to the public what that looks like. But we're doing the same thing in terms of the kind of data that we collect. And so if we're focused only on, you know, certain kinds of numeric data that are a representation of what students have learned, then we're suggesting to the public that that's what learning is all about. So we do have this tremendous opportunity and responsibility, I think, to start to think about how can we measure and share data that's not just purely numerical data about how students are learning. And I think that's something that we're actually thinking at the museum, and I'm pointing over to Elaine because she's in my small program, teacher education in the museum. We're preparing our science teachers, and a lot of the data that we're collecting right now is numerical data. We're not collecting a lot of data on how students are learning or how they're feeling in classrooms or the kind of motivation or whether they feel like they're known. So this idea of sort of how can we expand the way that we think about what students are learning and how we are preparing our teachers to affect that kind of learning is a really important one for us to grapple with. Maybe it's another dilemma for us to be thinking about.
Right, and is student voice as captured through a student survey that then becomes quantified actually an expression of students?
Right.
So yeah,
so what's the way to think
right.
about that will help
It's
us?
better than just looking at them as a test score, but
Right.
Emily, I think you had a comment.
Well, in a, is this on? No. Is it now? Is it now? In a cloud-based online environment where everything anybody does all the time is a data point, you're really swimming in data, literally. But you also have the luxury and the opportunity to pick and choose what research questions you want to ask. So when I said earlier that we actually use our data to drive, literally on a day-to-day basis, how we deliver this program, because it's instant. It's instant. You have a platform that actually tells you every time somebody, not every time they do something, but exactly what they do. And the platform is actually able to analyze it for you.
Great.
It's very powerful.
So Bob and I talked before the session. We have about 6 minutes left, and we actually wanted to try to get some community voice as we're talking about it by having some comments or questions, reactions from the audience. So I'm not sure what our mic situation is in the audience, but I assume most of you have teacher voices and can probably project.
And then you could repeat the question.
And that's a good idea. I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear. But we probably have time for 2 or 3 questions or comments, so I will do a scan of the audience and see who's ready to jump into the conversation. Now, you all said at lunch you wish that you could be involved in the conversation. Yes, in the back. So the big idea is how do we get faculty operating as a we to make some of these big decisions about a program?
So I think some of it just takes time, and I know that's kind of a cliched answer, but we've been using the class, for example, in our program for more than 10 years now, and so I think it's over time and having people have the opportunities to see it and think about how it can work. Some of it is just a slow developmental kind of process. We do have a lot of committees, and so when I talk about we, sometimes it's the we of the committee who's spending time really engaged. And a committee is more people who are willing and eager to engage in the conversation. That it's not to say that these things are implemented in a kind of uniform way across the program. That's kind of the goal, but I don't know the degree to which that's a possibility.
Please.
Real brief. I would just say it's more complicated than getting we, the faculty, together. That what we need to do is also bring in the teachers who are an integral part of the programs, and they need to be at the table as we, decide what to do. And beyond that, I think we exist in communities, and that there are leaders in those communities that need to be consulted, and so it's extremely complicated process to do, but it is challenging to get even the faculty together, but I think it needs to be broader than that.
Diana.
One of the things we did was we conceptualized a leader, change agent, facilitator model. And so when we came upon something that we wanted to try to move forward, we had a leader. So it might be your dean to kind of get you off the ground. And then there are change agent faculty and people with, who would be able to facilitate the carrying out that vision. As each one of our innovations got ramped up, that triad changed a little bit. So the dean was not necessarily the leader in implementing co-teaching, for example. It was a team of faculty who then brought on some more faculty to be the change agent role, and then we brought in the appropriate facilitators if they were P12 partners or other folks to be able to make that work happen. So that was one way we kind of conceptualized that work throughout. The other thing I would mention is resources. I guess at some point we put our money where our mouth was, and we said we wanted to do these things. So we resourced research support and brought that in where it didn't exist because we're not an R1 faculty. So we brought in some of that by partnering with places like SIP and EPIC in Chapel Hill. We also provided travel support for those faculty and some P12 partners to go and present the work that they were doing, and also to learn and receive training and professional development. And then the third thing would be graduate assistance, that some of this, doing it at large scale, you need to have some support. You can't put it on the back of a faculty member, and so graduate assistants were allocated for projects that were aligned with those particular innovations.
So I think we have time for one more question or comment. Yes, please.
I think it was Ken who mentioned that there may be federal legislation on the horizon that would provide more flexibility for educator preparation. I'd just like to hear more about that, if I heard correctly.
I'm going to be talking about that in my comments. So,
So yes, you will hear.
Good lead in.
We can do that.
Okay.
All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much.